Hi, thanks. Normally I try to avoid getting involved in political controversy, so finding myself sandwiched between two politicians is not ideal from my point of view because it constrains me somewhat. Nevertheless, there are things that have to be said, and I suppose not everyone will agree with what I'm going to say. First of all, I suppose when we look at where the world is, which I think really matters, it's involved in what's called a Great Recession, and this is to distinguish it from the Great Depression of the 1930s. And the reason is that while it's bad in the industrial world, it's not remotely as bad as what happened in the 1930s. And for those of you of a certain vintage, you might remember the 1950s, not to mention the 1980s. I think if you lived here in the 1950s, you know what poverty was, and you'd know what inequality was, and you'd know what bad policies were. And this is the third time in my life that I've gone through the same mess. I often said my youth was destroyed by the political process, and I blame politicians for that. My middle years were destroyed by politicians, and as far as I can see, my old age is going to be destroyed by them as well. Right? So while I use the term Great Recession to refer to what's going on at the moment, I find it depressing. Right? So I could call it just as easily the Great Depression. But nevertheless, it's important to make those distinctions. Now, the reason that this Great Recession is not as bad as the previous experience is because of what was learned in the earlier period, and people used what was learned in the earlier period, particularly in the US and the UK, to mitigate the effects of what actually happened. On the other hand, it's quite clear that in the case of the US, that the fiscal stimulus that was given was probably not sufficient. And in the case of the UK, that the fiscal stimulus was inappropriate. The nature of it was inappropriate in terms of the increase in public expenditure rather than perhaps tax changes. And in both cases, the recovery is faltering, which I think is a problem from the world economy's point of view. In the Eurozone, of course, you don't have a single entity. I think this is really important. You don't have a fiscal authority for the Eurozone, so you have quite different experience. You have quite different reaction to the financial crisis. The financial crisis has hit different countries differentially, and the solutions that have been proposed for the financial crisis in Europe are really very different from the sort of solutions you'd expect to get in a unitary state such as the US, I suppose, or a federation as the US, or a unitary state such as the United Kingdom. And in both of those cases, what governments, the treasuries did and what the central banks did was they acted in concert to mitigate the effects of the recession and the financial crisis. And to a certain extent it's worked, but as I said, probably not to the full extent that you might expect. In the Eurozone, we don't have that. We don't have a central government. We may have a central bank, but you need a central government to help in the decision making. And I think that is one of the big issues in corporate governance that has arisen in this crisis, that we lack that central government function. Now, getting it, of course, turns out to be much more difficult than you might think, and it involves giving up even more sovereignty than has been given up now, but you'd hope that it would be done by agreement rather than by anything else. Right? The response that I see in the Eurozone has been inadequate because it has been an attempt to ignore the spillover effects on economies affected mostly by the financial crisis and the spillover effects onto others. And what I mean by that is that if we reneged on bondholders, that would have an effect on other economies. It would affect on banks in other countries. I don't describe them as necessarily reckless lenders, but they lent, and it has spillover effects which other governments would have to make up. And that's my argument for saying that you actually need some burden sharing. You need burden sharing because of spillover effects. Because if we didn't act to do this, the effects would be felt in other economies. That seems to me to be a really good argument for it. Now, it happens that the Eurozone as a whole is not at that point yet, but I think last week there was a lot more progress made towards the resolution of the problem than many people had thought. As I said, I have no interest in politics. When I talked to people, I was getting political reactions. They said nothing would happen last week. We would just get on as we were before. But what actually happened last week is very beneficial from Ireland's point of view. I think saving £1 billion a year in interest is significant. It's not trivial. And I think that the lengthening of the loan period matters because it means you don't have to roll over the debt so early. I think that does matter from our point of view. And I'm less concerned about the necessity to get back to markets because I think the funds that were created will provide the funding if there's an issue about getting back to markets. On the other hand, once that is open and it's known that you can get the funding, it's possible, if we meet the other targets, that we can get back to markets anyway. So I think that's less of an issue. Now, that's the first set of points I want to make. The second is to do with recovery. Whatever about the notion of recovery in the US and the UK and in other economies affected by this recession, I think the idea of recovery in the case of Ireland is just wrong. And the reason is that what we suffered from was a bubble, right? And it wasn't a classic business cycle. It was a bubble. The bubble collapsed. What we have to do is to resume growth, which is a different concept. If you have a normal business cycle, you might expect a recovery. You might even expect the recovery to be quite fast and quite rapid, which is why the US thing is so disappointing, that the recovery is so muted there. But that would be your expectation. But what happened to us was entirely different. We had a structural imbalance in the economy. The economy went through this bubble. This bubble has gone, and now we find that we have a whole series of what I call structural problems. The structural imbalances I see are in the banking system. You have a private sector that has an excess amount of debt. You have a public sector imbalance that requires dealing with again. And I suppose you have a structural problem in relation to unemployment, right? So these are four separate structural problems that have arisen because of the bubble. Now, it's really important to accept that it was the bubble that caused the problems. It's not a business cycle. It's a bubble effect. So you need a different approach to a bubble. In terms of the public sector imbalances require restructuring of the tax system and also the expenditure system, because over the period of the bubble, what we did was we fundamentally changed the tax system. We took something like half the population out of the income tax net, and that's simply just a mistake. Yes? You shouldn't do that. Your citizens should pay taxes. I think it's a matter of course. And if you think their incomes are too low, you find other ways for dealing with it, but I think people should pay taxes. Then, prior to this, the creation of the bubble, we actually had a model which was not too bad. It delivered full employment. For instance, we got to 1999, 2000, we had full employment. Real income levels were reasonably okay. They were higher than they had ever been before. And we had a budget surplus, we had a balance of payment surplus, we had low inflation, we had full employment, and we did things more or less right. The mistake we made really was that when we joined the Eurozone, our banking system had access to the Eurozone interbank market. And they were able to borrow more or less at will in that market. And as a consequence, they built up liabilities in that interbank market, but the assets that corresponded to those liabilities turned out to be poor and actually much worse than we had expected them to be. And this is the nature of the problem that we got. And that's, in a sense, what created the problem. The losses associated with the write-downs were well beyond the capacity of the commercial banking system here to bear. And this required that the government put in the funds to deal with them. And irrespective, in a sense, of where the funds had come from, once they had borrowed the funds and lost so much, then government was more or less required to provide funds to the system as a whole. Whatever about an individual bank, but the system as a whole required them. There is a view that banks as a whole should have been let fail. I can tell you that no society would function without a banking system, and we would descend into poverty, absolute poverty. So it's not an option that you can consider. Right? In general, governments are reluctant to see depositors lose money. I'm not quite sure why. I always felt that if depositors faced a potential loss, they might be more concerned about where they put their funds. And I notice when people say bondholders should lose, in a sense, the guarantee guarantees the bondholders, whether it's implicit or explicit. Right? You don't have to make it explicit. It's implicit in the way we operate. Irrespective of those guarantees, you will find it difficult to let people incur losses. It's also important to note that there will be significant knock-on effects to other economies if we did this, and the ECB and the EU have made it clear that the funding that's been given is conditional on that not happening. In other words, the 150 billion or 160 billion that the ECB has provided to the Irish banking system would not be given if bondholders were maintained. Now, I've made this point earlier. Because of the spillover effects, I think you need a different approach, and I think that you actually do need some burden sharing. But it's not up to us. We can't impose that on others. If we do, there are consequences to us. And I think the logic behind trying to isolate the problem, so Ireland is in a box, Greece is in a box, Portugal is in a box, I think is simply wrong because of these spillover effects. We're in a monetary union, and a monetary union has interdependencies. And I think that any solution to this problem requires the acceptance of that. So I see last Thursday as a step, and a necessary step, in getting to what I think is the final solution, which may take a little bit of while down the road. Right? I said I've made this case before. In the last commentary I produced, I made that case. And I know some of my colleagues thought I was being excessively optimistic, thinking anything would happen. But I think Thursday shows that you can make progress. Right? Now, that's, I suppose, the first of those points. Right? I think I agree with Pearse about distinguishing in the national debt between the debt that's due to operations of government in terms of its normal borrowing and that due to the banking crisis. I think we should flag that so we know the mistakes that we have made, right? And it's right there in front of us. We can't hide it. So we know if we borrowed 60 billion to finance the recapitalisation of the banks, that we are always reminded of that. I think the banks need to know and need to be constantly reminded that they were the architects of this trauma. Okay, now, the other point, that's the banking system. The second point I want to make is about the public finances. I said that the collapse of the bubble has led to the collapse of the public finances. During the period of the bubble, we know that government revenue increased, and that led to reductions in taxes, the removal of people from the tax code, as I mentioned already. It led to new programmes of expenditure, and led to increases in existing programmes, and also to an increase in wage rates throughout the public sector. Now, when the bubbles collapsed, the public finances collapsed immediately. In September, October 2008, I saw that collapse in output taking place in the economy. I knew that in 2009 output would fall dramatically. I thought the fall would be about 8%, turned out to be about 10%. As a consequence, the public finances deteriorated dramatically. And what we've been trying to do since is to restore balance to that. Part of this restoration has come because of the changes that were made prior to and subsequent to the Troika. And most of what's in the Troika package was already in what the programme of government was. So it's not that just we've lost sovereignty, we were more or less ready to give it up anyway. The public finance deterioration has led to further increases in net debt, and this will continue for some years to come until the deficit is wound down. The figures that are around are probably a bit too pessimistic. The 200 billion by 2015 is not consistent with the numbers that I'm working with and with what government has put out. But nevertheless, it's a number. Right? The reduction in the deficit is proving difficult. It's necessitated cuts in programmes, increased charges for services, public sector pay cuts, pension levy, which I think is really a pay cut, lower rates of pay for new entrants, which people haven't really commented on. This is a really interesting change that's taken place. New people coming into the public service are paid less than those who are there already. I cannot imagine that happening in the 1980s, but it has happened now. Then this famous reduction in waste, which I hear less about now. That's not delivering the product because people have discovered reducing waste is not painless. Someone is going to be adversely affected. I think prior to the election, I saw figures of 5 billion about savings that would occur because of reductions in waste. I don't see that number appearing anymore, although I heard one tonight, which I still think is a bit fanciful. I think that there aren't savings to be made that involve waste. Right? There are savings to be made, but someone will be adversely affected. That's the point. Right? Now, you might decide that some programs are programs you don't want. That's a different point. That's not waste. Right? Waste is where you're spending money that gives you no benefit, and stopping it will leave everything else unchanged except you've saved the money. I don't see that happening. That's not in the system at all. The third area of restructuring is within the private sector. Some elements of the corporate sector got involved in property, using their existing businesses as collateral. And the main effect of what's happened there, I think, will be a change in ownership. Businesses will be sold, they'll be bought by other people, and then they will run them successfully, and that will reduce the indebtedness. The property development sector, of course, has suffered catastrophic losses. You know that. And these are reflected, as we know, in the banking losses. The household sector is now engaged in this major deleveraging activity. It's increasing its savings, reducing its indebtedness, and it's all an attempt to get back to some sort of normality in relation to its borrowing and so on. But there are still potential losses for the household sector because we don't know what the extent really is of negative equity. We think that's an area that needs a lot more work. Right? The final area of restructuring is in relation to the labour market. The level of unemployment is primarily structural, and it's structural because the construction sector has collapsed, and that sector is not going to go back to levels of activity that there were before. So the people who worked in that have skills that will no longer be required. That's what we mean when we say it's a structural problem. Output will increase to a certain extent in the economy as a whole from the present depressed levels, but in the construction sector, they're very unlikely to go back to the levels that prevailed in 2007, 2008. And I even doubt if, in the construction sector, if they'll go back to 1999, 2000 levels. I just don't see that happening at all. Right? At least for a very long time, probably well beyond my lifetime. Right? The fall in employment in the construction sector will not be reversed. That's what I meant when I said it's a bubble, it's a structural problem. You can't get back to where you were before. There'll probably be some change in terms of micro projects. I think there will be projects to do with schools, home heating and so on. That will make some slight difference, but you're talking about small amounts. And I suppose the nature of the problem, the structural problem in the economy, can be seen when you have this huge number of people who are unemployed. And at the same time, we know there are shortages of labour in some parts of the multinational sector and also now in the new multinational services. So I think when you look at this economy, what you do is you see a whole series of major restructuring problems. They would have easier solutions if there was a resumption of growth. And you often hear people saying, well, if we can grow, everything will be all right. Growth isn't a policy option. It's the outcome of policy changes. Right? So you don't go for growth. Right? You do things that help growth get along. Right? Output, I think, at the moment has probably stabilised a bit after 3 years of decline, although I'm not, the first half of the year seems to me to have been very odd, right? But I think there are probably reasons for that. I think the private sector is very cautious because of the fears of the upcoming tax and interest rate changes. The really important thing that's happened in the last 18 months, which I think people have probably ignored, has been the growth in exports, and in particular the growth in exports from indigenous companies. And this is a point that I referred to in the last report I brought out, and I think it's worth saying a little bit about it. So I'm going to talk now about growth and how it can be nourished, because I think that's really what matters. And I'm not talking about stimulus. I'm talking about the economy growing itself, not organically, but growing. It has often been asserted that you can't deflate out of a recession, and this has been an argument against the fiscal correction. There are several things wrong with this. First, the country in Ireland's position, there is and was no possibility of financing a fiscal expansion. The funds that were there in the National Pension Reserve Fund and others, these are going to be needed over the next few years in order to ensure that we can actually continue to spend at the levels that we think we can sustain. Right? That's the first thing. Second, the collapse in the economy was collapse in a bubble. It's not a business cycle. And so you don't stimulate when you haven't got a business cycle effect. You have a structure problem. That's not going to give you what you want. Third, it's simply incorrect to see the correction of the public finances as only contractionary. I think that's the fundamental mistake that's been made. It's very easy to estimate the direct impact of budget cuts. People do it all the time. We do it. We have models that do it. But that's not what happens in an economy tends to be very different. I think when you contract the economy, the private sector just doesn't roll over and die. It tries to find a way it can sustain its activity. Right? And what's happened in the last 18 months or so is that the private sector, the indigenous private sector, I'm not talking about the multinationals, they just export. The indigenous private sector has started to export. And exports last year from the indigenous sector grows by about 10%. This is mostly in the food and in the drink sector. And what that does is that helps the economy. It stops the contraction being as bad as it might otherwise be. And the interesting thing is that when you look at the models that people have of this economy and others, the models don't take account of that. Now, curiously, this is one of the advantages of being older. Right? I remember models in the 60s where this was exactly what happened, that you had a balance of payments problem, and what you did was you contracted activity in the economy, and then the private sector would export as a means of ensuring that it could sustain its activities. And that's what's going on now in this economy. I think this really matters. Right? The private sector, as I said, just doesn't roll over and die. Those in the traded goods sectors try to replace lost domestic demand, so they seek markets abroad. And what was interesting was that during the bubble, many of them had got resources which allowed them the opportunity to do that. They had the resources to go into markets abroad. I remember in the 1980s, people, when they started getting into overseas markets, they always ensured they had enough money so that if the attempt to get into overseas markets failed, the company wouldn't fail. And this time they're in a much stronger position because they had the background of the resources generated during the bubble. So you don't get, the likelihood is that more will do it. And what happens then is they attempt to replace lost domestic demand by an increase in exports. This is what happened last year, and it looks to me like it's still well underway this year. And I think the growth in exports from indigenous companies will be of the same order of magnitude as last year, be somewhere around 10% again. Now, the point about this is that, remember, the domestic contraction from government is very big, so the impact of the increase in exports isn't enough to fully outweigh it. Right? But it will when the fiscal contraction is over. Right? When we stop doing that, then we'll start to see some positive growth. I'll come to that in a minute anyway. I think this is... Pardon?
It'll be 1 minute, though.
Okay, 1 minute.
Overtime now.
Well, we'll do the minute, right? Will we do a minute? Well, we'll try, right? So the issue then that I see is what we have to do is we have to try and sustain this growth. Right? So I'm going to skip a big part of what I wanted to say. And what we have to do in this economy is we have to take these indigenous companies and we have to help them and improve their competitiveness. And in the paper I talk a bit about how you do this. I mean, the biggest single thing that affects them is the domestic cost base. And the domestic cost base is hugely influenced directly by consumer prices and indirectly wages which are influenced by consumer prices. When you look at consumer prices in Ireland and the changes that have taken place, the thing that really strikes you is that the prices of goods have fallen, but services in many cases have increased. And have increased because a large number are public services, and they do not seem to be subject to any sort of market discipline at all. And you also have the operation of monopolies, monopoly groups, and so on. And I think government should effectively attack that and see what's wrong with the domestic cost base that firms face. And the National Competitiveness Council last year, for instance, did bring out a report which goes through that, and it's worthwhile looking at because it gives you an idea of the sort of things that have to be done if you want to do it. And the point is that if you can reduce the general price level, that will improve competitiveness. There are other factors. I talk about upward-only rent increases, which seems to me to be just a perversity in the current climate. You expect prices to fall rather than to rise, so rent should fall. That will make it easier for firms to get into business, so you need to do that. And the fact that NAMA now wants upward-only increases seems to me to be a perversion of what its role should be. Its role should be, in addition to looking after the value, but it should also be trying to ensure that there's a competitiveness in the economy. So we have to be careful that state agencies themselves are not working against the improvement in competitiveness. Then the final thing, I suppose, is just a separate thought, which I won't develop because the time is short, is to do with the savings rate. Now, I've made this point before. The savings rate now is somewhere between 12 and 13%. This is the personal savings rate. Now, we're not saying that everyone saves that. There are categories of people who save. There are others who can't save. They're just about surviving. And there are others who save small amounts. But there's no doubt the savings rate has increased. And it's increased partly because of this deleveraging I talked about, but it's also increased because of uncertainty about the future, in particular about tax rates. And I think that the government could easily sort that out by making clear what tax changes are going to be over the next 2 to 3 years. Not in general, but specifically. People need to know what's going to happen. And then they can plan. And I think if you know what was going to happen, then people could plan and you could get a reduction in the savings rate. Because the rise in savings has had almost as much an effect on domestic demand as what the government has done. So if the savings rate increases from 5 to 13, that's an 8 percentage point increase on disposable income. That's a huge deflation. It has a huge deflationary impact on the economy, and you need to reverse it. Right? And the same thing applies to the corporate sector. So I finish now. While it's been difficult to be positive for the last 4 years, the shift from meeting domestic demand to export by indigenous firms, to my mind, is a great source of hope. I think that's what's going to pull us out of this. Not posturing and saying we're going to do this or whatever. That's what will get us out of this. To date, the impact from this has been not sufficient to outweigh what the government is doing, but the government has to do what it's doing. But it will soon stop. Within maybe 3 years, the deflationary impact will be out of the system, and then the impact of increased exports on the rest of the economy will actually become more apparent, and the economy can resume growth. I started by saying it's a resumption of growth we want. We're not interested in thinking about a recovery because that's not going to happen. We don't ever want to go back to where we were before in terms of output in construction. What we want is to resume the growth that we were good at least up to 1999. And I think if we do that, then we will have a chance of getting out of this. And then we can build the kind of society we want. Right? And I'll leave that to the politicians because although I've become more and more clear in my own mind that leaving it to them hasn't been the best of the world. Right? I think
No problem. Thank you very much for that, Joe Durkan. Sorry to condense your time there a little, but we may pick up some of those points, particularly about the savings rate and cost cutting and that interesting information which Joe has been highlighting about indigenous companies exporting. When we come to the Q&A section now, I'm going to read this next bit here. It says, Brian Hayes, Minister for State at the Department of Finance. He's the Deputy from Dublin South West, not to be confused with Donegal South West. But he's come to Donegal South West to address us at the MacGill School tonight. Minister.